Hello, everybody. I hope you're all doing well. Hope you had a good weekend. Today, we're going to go ahead and cover Chapter 2, Sociological Research. I'm not going to spend... Actually, I'm not going to go into too much detail as far as the research methods, as far as the different types. So I'm going to cover them briefly, but we're not doing a research paper this semester. You guys are going to be pretty much focusing on reflections, things like that, application of theories, but we're not doing a full-blown research paper. So I'm not going to go into too much of that, but I do want you to understand some of the concepts from this chapter because they are important, not just for this class, but for every other class you'll probably take, especially in the social sciences, and then just, as far as understanding the data and the material that's presented to you by news media, social media, any of those things, but we'll get into it. So like I said, I'm not going to focus on too much of the writing portion, okay? So let's go and get started. So the goal of research is to answer questions. So that's where we're at, right? That's the whole point. If you're a researcher, even if it's in the social sciences or it doesn't matter what it is, your goal is to find answers. That's the idea, okay? But the interesting part about finding those answers is what answers should you be looking for? And why should you care, okay? The problem, or I guess the difficulty when it comes to the social sciences, is getting people to understand or getting people to care about maybe the things that you may care about, okay? Not the easiest thing in the world to do. Like you can come up to, the problem is that some things may be very personal to you, may hit home, a social issue, but it may not hit home for somebody else. And like I said, we don't live in the world in a vacuum. We don't live by ourselves. We rely on a society to essentially help us, and we live within a society. So if we want some sort of social phenomena if we want to work on or help make better a particular social phenomena, we need to show people why it affects them or how it could affect them. This is the whole sociological imagination, right? Being able to understand how things that are external to yourself can affect you, okay? So what kind of questions do we ask, right? Well, we ask questions about the social world, right? We ask questions about the institutions that are supposed to serve us. We ask questions about how those institutions function with us, how we function with them, the back and forth. But really that's what it is. Sociological research attempts to answer questions about the social world. And the social world is essentially everything that is the society that we live in. Okay, in all the institutions that we have to deal with, the bureaucracy, in its entirety. The book uses the term the universe of discourse, and I actually kind of like that idea, right? The world is chaotic. Sometimes more than others, but still nonetheless chaotic. When you think about the way we live on top of each other, we live in crowded cities, at least for us in Orange County in Southern California. It's pretty condensed, right? We do deal with a lot of different people. And there is discourse. There is disagreements over how things should be done, what works for us, what doesn't. This is the world that we live in. And this is a very difficult world to manage from a functionalist perspective. Think about that. From a functionalist perspective, how do you get the types of how do you create order? How do you make sure that everything runs smoothly when you have a community, a society that is as diverse as ours? It's a very difficult thing to do, okay? So, and that's where it leads me to this part here. They involve cultural areas which need to be physically bounded, and we do need to be physically bound culture areas. Okay, so I'm going to cover just a few quick things here. They're going to help us out. Opinions. Now, we're not in a classroom setting, a face-to-face setting, unfortunately. But in a classroom setting, well, if we were in class, what I would have hoped would have happened is that we would have discussions in class about the material that we're covering. And hopefully you would share experiences, opinions, things like that. But that's the thing, though. When we share opinions about a particular topic or subject, those opinions are usually based on some type of personal experience that we may have had, or secondhand, right? Maybe something your parents might have told you. Maybe your parents had a particular experience with one thing and they told you not to do it, or they shared that experience with you, over a lifetime, as a young kid, and now that experience that wasn't yours firsthand almost kind of becomes your first-hand experience, right? It's one of those things where, well, that never happened to me, but I know somebody that it happened to, and it almost becomes fact. This is just the way it is because somebody I trust has told me that this is their experience, right? And we take that experience as truth. Okay, we got to be careful with that. Okay, we got to really be careful. People's opinions being used as fact. And then we have bias, right? Which is essentially a prejudice in favor of or against one thing, a person, a group, compared with another, usually in a way considered to be unfair. Do we want to research to rely on opinions and biases? The answer to that is no, we don't. When information is presented to us, it doesn't matter where it's from. It could be news media, it could be social media, it could be books that we read, it could be anything. It could be journal articles that we read. If you guys haven't read journal articles yet, you might want to start looking into those. Anything, any type of media, any type of literature that tries to argue for a particular angle or particular side or particular opinion, we have to be wary of. And that's not a bad thing. We should be critical of the information that's presented to us, okay? But the thing is, it's very difficult to remove bias from your research. So if we were all researchers, okay? If I was conducting research, more often than not, I would probably pick something to study or to work on or to research that I felt strongly about, okay? And if I feel strongly about something, then things I have a bias, right? So example of that would be something along the lines of, in my own personal, I used to do a lot of work with at-risk youth, so sports programs, things like that. So at-risk youth programs essentially are meant to make sure the kids to help kids that do not have a place to go after school, give them a place to go, make sure they're off the street, make sure they're not getting in trouble, give them an alternative to being just on the street. Okay, so at-risk youth sports programs, or just programs in general. Okay, so if I was conducting research, right, and the argument was that these programs, these at-risk youth sports programs, helps kids stay out of trouble, I would be biased because I work or have worked with these kind of programs in the past or currently work with these programs. I'm still involved. So if I work with a program that argues that as long as if you provide kids a place to go to keep them off the street, that they won't get in trouble. That's kind of the argument, right? That's the reason why these programs exist. And I was conducting research on that, I would be biased. If I was to put out information that's going to claim that these programs do work, you as the reader, once you found out that I work for one of these programs or in charge of one of these programs or affiliated with one of these programs, you should question me, saying, well, pretty much ask yourself, well, he works for these types of programs. Of course he would be biased. Of course he would say these programs work because he's involved with them. Okay? And that's kind of what you need to do when information is presented to you. When somebody makes a claim, ask yourself, well, who's the person who conducted that research? Where did they get that information? How did they get that information? What method did they use? Okay? And then when you do that, you can start to figure out if the person who conducted that research was able to remove their bias, remove their opinions from the information that was presented to you. And a good way, or the one way that we actually do that, is through use of the scientific method. So the scientific method is really just a framework that all researchers should use. And the reason we use that framework is to almost ensure that we remove bias, that we remove opinions, that we're completely transparent in the entire process of our research from beginning to end. And the end would be the information that's given. Okay? This is very, very important when it comes to research. It has to be done using the scientific method. And what the scientific method does is it looks for empirical evidence. And what empirical evidence is evidence. It's evidence that can be seen. It's evidence that can be measured. It's something that we can touch, something that we can prove exists. Okay? So the thing is, if it's not using the scientific method, if it's not empirical evidence, then I'd argue that you shouldn't trust that information. You shouldn't trust that data. Okay, and what empirical evidence is and why it's so important, like I said, it does give us the ability to measure, to see. Okay, and that's what we want. So when you're conducting research, you want to look for patterns. So say I'm doing research on kids that go to at-risk youth sports programs, okay, and then I want to go and see how many of them graduate from high school, how many of them have had any kind of altercations or run-ins with law enforcement, how many of them have been arrested, how many of them, have gotten in trouble, and how many of them have, not gotten in trouble. Okay, let's just say that. Let's just go and say one of the variables would be graduating from high school and then going to college. Okay, so let's say we have a youth sports program and there's 100 kids there. And out of those 100 kids that participated in that program, we could say that 70% of those kids graduated from high school. Okay, and out of those kids that graduated from high school, we can say that maybe, X amount of them actually went on to college. Okay, the thing is, I can measure all that. I can show you the kids, which ones graduated, which ones went on to college, which ones didn't go on to college. That's something that's real. That's something I can count. That's something I can measure. I can look for patterns. That would be considered empirical evidence. But if I said, yeah, I worked with a bunch of kids, at a program for, at-risk youth, and yeah, a bunch of them went to college, a bunch of them graduated, and you were asking, well, how many? I don't know, like 4 or 5 of them, 10 of them, 15, I gave you a number. I'm like, well, who were they? Well, I'm not sure, but, I know a few of them did. That's not proof. That's not empirical. Like you'd have to literally measure the number of students who graduated from high school, the students that graduated from college or went on to college, or how many of the students have got in trouble, how many of the students have dropped out. All those things we're able to measure. That is empirical evidence. That's what you want. That's the kind of information. That's a process that you want. That's how you want your information to be gathered. When you watch the news and you see a story or a poll of so many Americans believe this, so many Americans believe that, or we have new data that proves this or proves that, you want to ask yourself, who conducted that research? How did they conduct that research? Was it surveys? Was it interviews? Was it done using a scientific method? Because if it wasn't, then I would not trust the information that's being presented to me. Okay? All right. The next step in the research process is a hypothesis. And I just covered one right now, right, with the at-risk youth sports program. But let's go over another one. We'll talk about something that I really love talking about. Something I'm very interested in, and it's actually something I would like to have done research on. Or might even still do research on. Or maybe you could too, right? If any of you here are sociology majors and you actually want to go on and get a master's degree and do a thesis or a project, this would be a good topic, right? So hypothesis is a testable, educated guess about predicted outcomes between 2 or more variables. Okay, well, what does that mean? Well, you have to have your independent and your dependent variable. Okay, so one thing I love talking about is the crisis, the homeless population crisis that we're having, not just here in Southern California or in California, but I would say globally for the most part. In most industrialized or very westernized countries, we have a huge issue with homeless populations. But we're going to focus just kind of here in Orange County, Southern California, okay, because that's our stomping grounds. Everybody's have had experiences with homeless people, okay, and varying different levels. Okay, so the hypothesis is, well, it could be. It's something I was reading not too long ago that I found interesting was, or say a solution would be transitional housing, right? So hypothesis is a testable, educated guess about predicted outcomes, okay? It provides a possible explanation for specific happenings in the social world. Allows for us, or should I say, allows for testing to determine whether the explanation holds true in many instances, as well as among various groups or different places. Okay, so let's go ahead and work through our hypothesis using homelessness. Okay, so hypothesis. solution, right? Everybody's trying to find a solution to the homelessness issue we're having, right? A bunch of different people are coming up with a bunch of different solutions, right? LA County, they're giving tax breaks, or essentially they're paying individuals who are willing to convert their garages into, like makeshift homeless shelters or a little home. Like they're doing all kinds of things. They're trying to get really creative, right? But one thing that I have heard of that I think might help would be transitional housing. Okay, and if you're not familiar with that, let's just go over it real quick because we're going to be using it for this hypothesis. Transitional housing argues that individuals that are homeless have a hard time getting back on their feet because they lack, well, a home. So if you're able to provide them with a temporary home, a transitional home, it would make it easier for them to get back on their feet. So if I'm an individual who's homeless, right? Say I lost my job, lost my house, lost my apartment, whatever lost, I'm living in my car, okay? If you're living in your car, I'd argue you're homeless, okay? And we'll go over how to define the terms in the research process. But we'll just say a homeless person is somebody who does not have a physical address, whether it be apartment, a house, doesn't matter. Whether renting or own, doesn't matter. So we'll argue that a vehicle does not count as a physical address. So if you're living in your car, we're going to go, just for the sake of this hypothesis, for this argument, that you are homeless. Okay, so let's say I'm living in my car. Is it difficult for me to shower? Is it difficult for me to keep my clothes clean? Is it difficult? Yeah, it would be. It would be difficult for you to do a lot of things if you live out of your car. So imagine how difficult it would be to find a job if you're living out of your car, right? Filling out applications online. So you got to find some place where you can, power up your laptop. As far as your clothing, you got a suit. You can't go into an interview with a suit that's wrinkled. You can't go to, you have to be able to keep these things neat. Very difficult to do in a car. So the idea is, if I was homeless and living in my car and I'm trying to find work, it's difficult for me to do that living out of my car. But if somebody was to offer me a transitional home, that would be a home that I can use until I can transition out of that home into a property that I pay for myself. Okay, so that's the idea. Transitional housing gives individuals who are homeless opportunity and a place to live until they can get back on their feet. Okay, so that's what transitional housing is, and we're going to use that. It's important because this is how we're going to go ahead and form our hypothesis. Okay, so hypothesis is individuals who are homeless, if given the opportunity for transitional housing, will improve their chances of finding their own permanent housing situation. So no longer being homeless. Okay, so that's the argument. That's a hypothesis. If I give somebody access to transitional housing, it'll improve their odds of not being homeless. Okay, those are variables. Okay, that's the start of the research process. Okay, so now if that's your research, then you would go out and start conducting maybe interviews, surveys, do your literature review. You would start finding out as much information as you possibly can about transitional homes. Okay, so moving forward. So we kind of covered this already, the scientific method. The scientific method is a body of techniques for investigating social phenomena or just phenomena, acquiring new knowledge or correcting and integrating previous knowledge. This is also important. If you've ever had to do a research report or research paper and you've gone through a literature review, you'll find that sometimes the information that you are looking for isn't there. And if it's not there, it's because nobody's done the research on it. So you could go ahead and actually, with your research, add to the existing body of knowledge that exists. Or you can find information that's there that may be incorrect or outdated. So you can also add information to correct previous data that's there that may be, like I said, may be incorrect or outdated. All right, so like I said before, we've covered this as well. To be termed scientific, any data needs to be based on empirical or measurable evidence, subject to specific principles of reasoning. So the idea is we need to be able to make sure that the information that's provided to us is information that can be counted or measured. Okay, so now let's go back to our little hypothesis, right, with the homelessness crisis. If my hypothesis is transitional housing helps individuals that are homeless find jobs and permanent residences, then that would be something we can measure, right? If I provided 100, transitional homes to individuals who are homeless, I could count how many of those individuals were able to move out of that transitional housing situation into their own permanent housing situation they're able to maintain on their own. How many of them were able to find jobs? I can count all that. Okay, out of the 100 that we gave transitional houses to, 50% of them found a job. Out of those 50% that found jobs, X amount were able to find their own residence they're able to pay for on their own. Like, those are things we can measure. That's what's important. That's a scientific method. Something we can measure, something that we can see, something that is tangible. If it is not, then I would argue we wouldn't consider that to be data or fact. Okay? So these are just some things that I want you to bear in mind, or keep in mind when you're being presented with information. Okay? So the scientific method requires developing and testing of theories about the world based on empirical evidence. We've covered that. This is something that we need to cover, need to understand. So the scientific method or research should strive to be objective. And objective is essentially not influenced by personal feelings. So an example of being influenced by personal feelings. Let's say I worked for a company that builds transitional housing for homeless people. Okay, and then let's say that company that builds transitional housing for homeless people is paid for by tax dollars. Okay, now if I'm conducting research as an employee of a company that builds transitional housing, and I'm going to tell you that it works, that it's the greatest thing, this is the solution to end homelessness is transitional housing, right? If that's what I'm telling you as the public, as an employee of a company who builds transitional housing, would you believe me? Should you believe me? I'd argue no, you wouldn't, because it wouldn't be objective, right? Or I'd have to show you how I was able to make my research objective, right? How do I not let my personal feelings get in the way of the research that I'm conducting? Of course, if I work for a company that built transitional housings or transitional homes, of course I would want the results to be that they do work, right? It would be, counterproductive, I guess you would say, or it would go against my best interest if I had argued that these transitional housings don't work at all, and I work for a company that builds them. So you need to be objective when you conduct your research, right? And it's difficult to do, to be objective, because usually, like I said before, when you conduct research, you're usually researching something that you care about, something that's important to you, something that you feel strongly about. And if you feel strongly about something, then you may have some difficulty being objective, okay, with the results or how you're going to frame that research. So objective, you can't be influenced by personal feelings, or what the reality should be is that you have to be able to make sure that you can show that your personal feelings aren't influencing the information that you're presenting. Your personal feelings aren't influencing how you're conducting your research. Okay? Critical, plain and simple. Careful judgment of good or bad parts of something, right? Does this make sense to me? This guy's presenting, research about transitional housing, and he works for a company that builds transitional housing. I'm going to be critical of that. I'm not sure I'm going to trust this individual and what he says because he's biased, or there's potential bias there. Skeptical, not easily convinced, maintaining doubts or reservations, right? So you say, let's say you read information, right, about transitional housing and how it works. Skeptical would be, well, what does work mean? Okay, so how long does somebody have to be on their own until you consider that transitional housing program a success? So let's say you put somebody who's homeless in transitional housing, they're there for 3 or 4 months, they get on their feet, they get a job. Okay, should we call that a success? Some people will argue that, yeah, that's a success, right? They were here in transitional housing, they got out, they got a job, and they moved and they got their own apartment, right? But let's say after 6 months they lose that apartment and they're homeless again. Okay, now is the program a success? If they weren't able to maintain that home on their own, now they're back into the transitional housing program. So if I'm skeptical, those are the kind of questions. That's me being skeptical of the housing program, the transitional housing program. Yeah, it worked for maybe a couple months, 2-3 months, but after 6 months, they're homeless again. So why, as a taxpayer, why as a government should we be dumping millions of dollars into transitional housing if it doesn't help them stay off the street for, let's say, a year or two, 3 years? You got to define what success is for you in this program. As a society, what's successful, what's not, what works and what doesn't. So that's what being skeptical would be, or example of being skeptical or critical. And then logical. There's a capacity for clear and sound reasoning, right? And that does, it does sound logical, right? If somebody's homeless and they're trying to get a job, if you provide them with a temporary home, a base, where they can, take care of themselves, get cleaned up, sleep, work on resumes, things like that. If you provide them with a home, they should have an easier time finding another job, finding another place to live. That's logical, right? I'm not going to argue with that. That sounds, that would make sense. So when you're looking at information, the scientific method, it should strive to be all these things, okay? So the scientific method continued. Is it right or is it wrong? This is kind of a tough one, right? So the idea is, as sociologists or as researchers, we're not really concerned with right or wrong. What I mean by right or wrong, I mean issues that's of morality, okay? So if I'm a researcher and I'm conducting, research about homeless people, homeless populations, the thing is I can't or shouldn't judge them, okay? So if I'm conducting interviews or surveys, it's one of those things where if the individuals are having issues with, mental health issues, substance abuse issues, whatever issues they may be going through, as a researcher, I shouldn't judge them. Like that's not what we're concerned with. We're not concerned with issues of morality. Like, oh, well, you're homeless, but, well, you do have a substance abuse issue, right? And that's, some people argue morally wrong. You shouldn't do drugs. You shouldn't, abuse alcohol. You shouldn't do these things, right? As some people would argue. So some people would find that as a moral issue. Morally, you should stay away from drugs. Well, morally, that's not what we're concerned with as sociologists, or shouldn't be concerned with as sociologists. We should be concerned with really why people are doing what they're doing. And it's not right, it's not wrong, that's not our concern. Our concern is, why is this happening? That should be the focal point. That should be your main emphasis on why something's happening, and not so much the moral component, okay? Because the problem with morality is it shifts depending on what society you're in, what culture, how you were brought up. I'd argue that my moral compass or views may differ from yours, okay? We all live in Southern California, and we are, for the most part, I'd argue, a little bit different when it comes to moral issues. So we're not concerned with right or wrong as sociologists. We're concerned with why things are happening. We're not concerned with the moral issues that may have led you into homelessness. That's not going to help. We want to know why, okay? So is it right or is it wrong? Not concerned with that. Reliability. Well, reliability is just simply being trustworthy, okay? We want our research to perform consistently well. And really what that means is when I conduct my research, I want my research, my model, my project to function well in the sense that I could take that information, that research project, and apply it somewhere else. So let's say I'm conducting research on, like I said, transitional housing and homelessness, as far as if it works or if it doesn't work, helping them out in, let's say, the city of Santa Ana, right? And then I take my research and I move it to, let's say, the city of LA or various cities within LA County. I can conduct the same exact research and use exact same, literally, the model, the framework, everything in that other area, and it would perform well. That's what you want, okay, with your research. You want it to perform well. Okay, and then there's also issues of validity, um, which is almost like just logic. The quality of being logically or factually sound. Okay, we're not going to focus too much on that. So ask a question, and we've already kind of covered this. My apologies. This chapter is a little tedious, but we do. We need to ask a question. And like I said, we're not doing a research paper this semester or these 8 weeks. But if we were, you would ask yourself. I would ask you to ask yourself that question: what are you interested in? What matters to you? For the 8 weeks that you're in this class, technically you are, sociologists. You're researchers to some extent. I would ask you to essentially come up with something that you're interested in studying, something that affects you, right? Like I said, I like talking about homelessness because I argue that everybody in this class has dealt with somebody in some way, shape, or form that is homeless. Now, it could be somebody that's a relative. It could be somebody that's a friend. It could be somebody that you don't know, depending on where you live and your day, what your day looks like. You may come in contact with more people that are homeless than maybe somebody else in the class who maybe doesn't have much contact with homeless people. But the idea is everybody in this classroom knows or has had an experience to some extent with somebody who is homeless. Okay, so that's why I use an example, because it's something we're all familiar with to some extent. Like I said, though, when you start your research, you have to ask yourself a question. And that question is about some sort of social phenomenon. Okay? That's really what it comes down to. Why are so many people homeless? Why is the homeless population growing the way it is? Okay? I mean, it was one of the biggest things on the news until, other things happened recently. That was a huge issue. San Francisco, it's bad. LA, it's bad. Orange County, it's bad. Like, homelessness is something that nobody has been able to seem to get a handle on. Okay, that's a great question. Okay, and like I said, when it comes to research, you have to explain to some people why they should care about certain things. Maybe it's a situation where you live in an area in Orange County where you rarely ever deal with anybody who's homeless, where homelessness as a social issue doesn't affect you. Okay, you would have to explain to those people why it does and how it does affect them indirectly, how it affects society as a whole. Okay, so those are the kind of questions that you ask. Those are the kind of questions that research tries to answer. Okay, so moving forward, operational definition, defining the concepts and terms to be used. We've already kind of covered this. And really what you're doing when you're conducting your research, you need to define all the terms that you're using in your research so that your reader understands what you mean. Now, your reader may not agree with the way you define the terms or the way you set up your research, but that's okay. It could be a situation where I might not agree with it, but at least I understand how you're defining the terms, so how you're using the terms, which means I can understand how you're conducting your research or what your research means. So an example of that, right, would be homelessness, okay, or homeless person. So define a homeless person. What does it mean to be homeless? Does it mean that you don't have a permanent residence? Is what the example I used earlier, right? If you lack a permanent physical address, you are homeless, okay? So if you live out of your car, you're homeless. I could argue, right? If that's how I'm defining the terms, right? Or some people would argue that if you live in a home or live in an automobile or some kind of vehicle, it might not necessarily mean you're homeless. I mean, there's people that live in RVs. They retire, they cash in their 401k, they buy a $120,000 RV, and they spend the rest of their golden years traveling the USA. That is a home. That's their home. But most people, I'd argue, aren't living in six-figure RVs. And it doesn't really matter how you set it up for the most part, as long as you define the terms. So for the sake of our research, we're going to say that individuals who do not have a physical address are homeless. So anybody living in a car, that would not be considered or qualify as a physical address. You are homeless. And if that's the way we're defining the terms, at least my reader understands that's what what I mean. That's what I mean by that. And all the information, everything else in my research will be based off how I define those terms. And I've read research articles, peer-reviewed research articles that I didn't agree with. I read one. It was about law enforcement and community-oriented policing. Essentially, what the question was how minority populations, particularly Hispanic, and what's important that they use that word, feel about law enforcement in their community. And the question was something along the lines of, do they see them as a good presence within the community or as a bad presence within the community? Were they helpful or not helpful? Okay, so in this research, that's the way it was framed out. Do these minority populations view the law enforcement as helpful or not helpful? And I believe this research was done on the East Coast. And the term that they used was Hispanic. Okay, so I may not agree with the term Hispanic being used for research. Okay, but it's fine as long as I understand what the researcher's definition of Hispanic is. That way it helps me, understand the data that they're presenting. Okay, now the way he set it up, the research, it was on a scale from 1 to 5. 1 being the population, the minority population that views law enforcement as the most helpful and a good presence in the community, and 5 being, views them not as helpful and a horrible or a bad presence within the community. And like I said, we're going back, and the way he set this up, was the minority population he was looking at was Hispanic, and he used the term Hispanic. Now, Hispanic means your background, your descent is from a Spanish-speaking culture. Okay. The first population, the minority population of Hispanics, based on what he said, were Portuguese. So it went number 1 Portuguese, number 2 Cuban, number 3 Mexican, number 4 Puerto Rican, and number 5 Dominican. That was the way this individual's research was set up. That's the results. So Portuguese viewing law enforcement as a good presence, and the very last would be Dominicans viewing law enforcement as a bad presence within their community. Now, the problem with the way he operationalized that was Hispanic. What is Hispanic? Like I said before, it means you came from a Spanish-speaking culture. Portuguese people, I'd argue, probably do not come from a Spanish-speaking culture. A lot of people that are Portuguese themselves do not identify as Hispanic and do not identify as Latino. They identify as, and granted, some people will argue that they do, but the problem is that Portuguese people are not classified as Hispanic. They do not classify themselves as Hispanic, and other people do not classify them as Hispanic. I know there's issues with the census as far as how they should be included, but this is an issue. Okay, however you feel about the term Hispanic, however you feel about Portuguese as far as being possibly Hispanic, not Hispanic, the language is different. The idea is that the researcher, failed to properly operationalize the terms he was using in his research. Because people that are Portuguese do not consider themselves Hispanic. Okay, they're not speaking Spanish. So, like I said, I might have gone off on a little tangent. I apologize, but I hope that helps you understand the importance of operationalizing, how you operationalize your research as far as definitions and as far as how things are set up. Okay, you need to be careful with how you set those things up. Okay. Like I said, you guys aren't doing a research paper, so you don't really have to worry about this. But I just want to cover it really quickly because it is important. Okay, literature reviews initially might not be the most fun thing in the world to do, but if you do enough of them, they get much easier and they do actually become kind of fun, surprisingly to say. A literature review is essentially a review of any existing similar or related studies. So back to our homeless population study, right? If I'm conducting a literature review on homelessness, what I'm essentially doing is we're going through journal articles. I'm looking for peer-reviewed journal articles. And what journal articles are is essentially research that was done using the scientific method, and it's been reviewed by other academics. And essentially what they've done is given their stamp of approval as far as the information at least being conducted using the scientific method, and we can go ahead and assume that this research should be considered as empirical or measurable evidence. Okay, so when you're conducting your literature review, you're going through all these academically reviewed articles. This is why when you've done research in the past or research papers in the past, your maybe former professors might have told you not to use like Wikipedia or news articles or just stuff that we find on the internet from just news sources, like just things like that. The reason we don't want to use those is because they're not peer reviewed. They were information that's presented in those forms or those media by the media are not conducted using the scientific method for the most part, unless they're citing scientifically conducted research. Okay, but the literature review is important, and what the literature review will do is it'll show you what information already exists. So if I'm conducting research on homeless populations, I can find what research has already been done. I can also find gaps in the research. Maybe there isn't a lot of research on transitional housing and if that's effective or not. Okay, so if that's my research, transitional housing, helping homeless people, I conduct my literature review, go through all these journal articles and find out there's not a lot of articles about transitional housing. That means there's a gap in the research, or the gap in the in the knowledge that we have about transitional housing. So my research could fill in that gap. Okay, so it's important to conduct your literature review, and when you conduct your literature review, like I said, it lets you know about everything that's been done. And if you're conducting research, let's say homeless population research, like I've been using as an example, if I read 15, 20 articles, 30 articles, let's just say 20. If you read a good 20 journal articles, give or take, you have a pretty good understanding. I'm not saying you know everything, but you have a good base about what's there in the literature when it comes to homeless population and transitional housing, if that's what you're focusing on. Okay. And hypothesis, we've already talked about this, right? It's an assumption about two or more variables and how they are related. So essentially the idea is, in our little scenario that we use a homeless population, my hypothesis is that transitional housing will help homeless people get back on their feet. And when I mean get back on their feet, means get a job and move to their own residence that they can maintain. Okay, that's my hypothesis. Transitional housing gets people back into jobs and gets people back into their own homes. Okay, that's my hypothesis. Okay, and my hypothesis in that setup, we have your dependent and independent variable. So now your independent variable is the cause of the change. Okay, now in my little scenario, the thing being changed is the homeless person. The cause of the change is the transitional housing. Okay, and the dependent variable is the homeless person. Okay, so in my scenario, we have a homeless person. Okay, this is the dependent variable. The thing that is being changed is this homeless person and their status as a homeless person. The independent variables are the things that can help change that status for that homeless person. So independent variable in my scenario would be transitional housing. And you can add other variables, right? So I have a homeless person who is my dependent variable. That's the thing that's going to be changed, whether he's homeless or she is homeless or not. And the independent variables is, do they have access to transitional housing? That's one variable that could help them no longer be homeless. Next variable could be education. Let's say we add GED programs or education certificates or anything like that. So we add some kind of educational element or component to my research. Okay, and then we provide medical. And I say medical, it could be substance abuse issues, mental health issues, any kind of medical assistance. So in my research that I'm conducting, I have my dependent variable, which is the homeless person. Okay, and my independent variables, which are the things that cause the change, is transitional housing, education, and access to medical. Okay, those three things can change possibly whether or not this individual stays homeless or doesn't. That's the way it works. So you have your independent and dependent variable. Okay, and this is just a little immature little graph that's going to help, identify independent, dependent variables. I'm going to cover that. So, moving forward, there's two different routes. Well, there's two main routes you can go when it comes to conducting research. Now, you can add these two together, but usually this is just them separately, right? You have quantitative methods and you have qualitative methods, okay? So quantitative methods incorporate statistics. So for those of you who are good at statistics, fantastic. Those of you who are not good at statistics, do yourself a favor, and if you're looking for, get into research or looking for work, take statistics seriously. This is, unsolicited advice. I have quite a few friends that have done very well for themselves at a young age in their lives because they've focused on quantitative or statistics. So think about it. When you watch the news and there's any kind of information that's being presented to you, that's going to be statistics. That's going to be information that somebody has essentially taken and made a graph that they're going to show you. Think about even just the schools that you go to. Santa Ana College. I guarantee you there's at least a few people that work for Santa Ana College, and all they do is research for the college. Okay? So if the college wants to know how many students are coming in from X high schools, whatever high schools in the area, so they're going to be able to come up with a number for that, right? We're going to take all that information, all those numbers, all that quantitative information, and then present it, visually. We can see it. We can measure it. We can count it. Okay? How many students are graduating from Santa Ana College? How long does it take them to graduate? Where do they graduate to? Are students coming here for, AA and transfer? Are a lot of students coming here to learn technical skills and a trade? Like, there's somebody, I guarantee, working for Santa Ana College whose job, his or her job, is to get all that information, compile it, and then present it. That's a job. And that's a pretty well-paying job. Okay, so if you're interested in going into any of the social sciences or like that, and you are interested in numbers, statistics is the way to go. Right, so quantitative methods. The idea is I should just remove that because I don't really like that. Objective, not influenced by personal feelings or opinions, and considering and representing facts. I'd still argue that even quantitative research and quantitative information can be skewed based on bias. Okay, and what I mean by that is, if I work for, let's say, going back to that scenario, right, about people in transitional housing, if I work for a company that build those transitional houses, if I was doing quantitative research, just looking at numbers of people, I could possibly skew those numbers in a way that would benefit my company. Okay, so bias, it's always there. The next method would be qualitative, and qualitative, what that is, it's either participant observational research, which I'll cover in a little bit, or essentially interviews. Okay, so where quantitative methods, you're looking at large groups of people. I want numbers, large numbers. Okay, so if I want to conduct how many people want to buy a house after college, right? I can interview a bunch of college students, right? Not just, 20 or 30, but I'm talking like a couple hundred students, ask them what their plans are. That's quantitative. Maybe hand out a survey on campus and, a couple hundred students take a survey. That's quantitative, right? How many of them want to buy a house? My little survey would be, do you want to buy a house? What kind of house do you want to buy? Where do you want your house to be? How much do you want to spend on your house? That's my little survey about houses, right? And I can pass a little survey out to all the students on the campus. I can just, stand in one place, hand them out, however I want to distribute them. That's quantitative. Qualitative would be me saying or asking a student to sit down with me and interview them about buying a house or what their dreams of home ownership may or may not be. Okay. Now, the quantitative method using surveys will have a set number of questions, maybe 5, 10, 15 questions. The person fills them out, drops it in a box, that's it. There's no way for me as a researcher to ask any follow-up questions, okay? But if I'm doing an interview with a student about home ownership, I can. I know who that student is. I have their contact information. Even in the interview, I can go ahead and, probe and get into more detail. Maybe, in the survey, I ask, do you want to buy a house? And you put, no, I have no interest in buying a house. Okay? Well, if it's a survey and you have no interest in buying a house and I don't have any questions that are going to help me understand why not, that's pretty much the end of that survey, right? You don't want to buy a house, so what difference does it make, how much you want to spend? All my other follow-up questions in my survey wouldn't make a difference. But if I'm interviewing you and you say, well, I don't really want to buy a house. I'm like, oh, okay. Well, could you tell me more about why you don't want to buy a house? And you could say something along the lines of, well, I wanted to, but, I don't see it as a possibility in Orange County because home prices here are ridiculous. So I can ask you another question like, okay, well, would you be interested in moving somewhere else? And you'd be like, no, I don't want to move anywhere else. I like living in Orange County because that's where my family's at. That's where my job is, and I don't want to commute. I'm like, oh, okay, so you have no intention of buying because you can't afford to buy, not because necessarily you don't want to. So see what I mean? During an interview, I can ask questions, and depending on how you answer those questions, I can go ahead and ask for additional information or take the interview in a different direction, which is something you can't do with quantitative methods for the most part. Okay, so qualitative methods are really more interested in rich detail as opposed to numbers. All right, I'm going to skip this. All right, so this is stuff that we kind of already covered. Surveys. So really what a survey is a collection of data from subjects who respond to a series of questions about behaviors and opinions, right? So surveys target particular populations, right? And the example, little scenario we just talked about right now as far as, college students and home ownership, right? Who am I targeting? I'm targeting college students. That's my population of people that I'm interested in. I'm interested in finding out if college students are actually interested in buying a house. That's my population. That's the information I'm looking for, right? The researcher will choose a survey to survey a small sector of the population needs to be manageable. And what it means by this is I could, let's say my goal was to find out, like I said, if college students want to buy a house. Okay, that's my population, that's the target. But where am I going to find that population? Am I going to go just to Santa Ana College and ask students there? Am I going to go to Santiago Canyon? Am I going to go to Fullerton? Am I going to go to OC, Golden West? Where am I going to go? How big does this net have to be, right? Do I want to do all the community colleges within Orange County? Do I want to, venture out into LA County or, Riverside or San Bernardino County and maybe go to some of the colleges up there and ask students? It depends. It depends on what I'm looking for, right? But if my population is Orange County and college students, then I wouldn't need to go any further, okay? So that's really what this is asking. What your population is, what your sample is, and it needs to be manageable, right? If you're conducting a survey, you might want to keep it to something that you can actually handle. And let's say I'm going to ask college students, but I'm only going to ask college students in 3 campuses in Orange County. I'm going to ask students at Santa Ana. I'm going to ask students that are Golden West. I'm going to ask students at Santiago Canyon, right? Spread it out a little bit. So it just depends how you want to set that up. So this, for surveys, they can be random samples, and more often than not, they are random samples. And what I mean by that is that every person in a population has the same chance of being chosen for a study. So this is kind of the idea with, like say, Santa Ana College. If I want to conduct research and handle out surveys at Santa Ana College, how would I go about doing that, right? So I could go ahead and let's just say for sake of argument or just for conversation, right? Let's say I had access to emails of students at Santa Ana College. And what I did was I generated some kind of program that would or I had some type of program that would generate, a list of emails just randomly, like every other third student, every other second student, or every other 10th student, whatever, right? If I wanted to use emails, or if I was on campus physically, right? I'm going to go ahead and stand in the middle of the quad with the little booth and ask just anybody who walks by randomly, right? So if you're a student on campus, you might be asked to participate. You might not be, depending on whether or not you walk by my booth, but that's pretty random. Okay. The pros to the surveys is anonymity. So the idea is, if I hand out a survey, I ask you to fill it out, but you're not putting your name on the survey. All I know is that you're a student at Santa Ana College who filled out the survey and you dropped it in the box. I would have no way of knowing who you are. Okay. So this is a pretty good way of getting a feel or gauging how a population feels or thinks about a particular thing. Okay. And some people argue that is definitely a benefit. And the benefit to that anonymity is that people might be more comfortable in telling you how they feel about something if they know that there's no way that it would get back to them. Okay? So there's a benefit to that. It'd be like asking somebody, okay, I want to go ahead and want you to fill out this survey, and I want you to tell me about, how many times you've lied or how many times you've done something that is wrong, right? Now, if your name was attached to that survey, would you be honest in your response to those questions? Probably not. But if you knew that there's no way for the information to get back to you, or no way for you to be connected to those answers or those responses, you may feel more comfortable in being honest. So anonymity, there's definitely a pro to that. The cons to that anonymity is the fact that there's no way to follow up with the participant. So if I'm conducting research and you said something in your survey, I'd have to take that at face value. There's no way for me to know who you are, and there's no way for me to ask you any more additional questions. That's it. The information you've given me is all that I have. Okay? And really that's the con, right? The lack of rich detail. And interviews, we've talked about interviews already. And really what just interviews is just a one-on-one conversation between the researcher and the subject. Okay? Now the subject is free to respond however they wish, however they want. And the participant isn't limited by just a set amount of questions like a survey would limit them to. In an interview, you could talk about whatever you want. And like I said before, depending how your participant responds, you can ask questions, ask for more detail, you can probe, and the interview can go in different ways, different questions. Like, it's one of those things where it's much more fluid. Okay? All right, participant observational research. Is much more in depth. Like I said, there's quantitative and there's quantitative, which is just numbers, statistics, and then qualitative, which is rich detail. Now, you can conduct research that includes both, and this would be called mixed methods. So not only am I going to hand out surveys, but I'm also going to interview people. So you can do both in your research. Okay, there's nothing keeping you from doing both. Right? Now, participant observational research is another method that I would argue it is qualitative. Okay, in its approach. And really what that is when the researcher joins a particular participant or participant group. So an example of participant observational research using our homeless scenario that we're talking about would be me actually going and not just interviewing people that are homeless, but actually spending time with people that are homeless. So an example of that would be, let's say, maybe it was a year or two ago when they had the huge encampments on the river trail, the Santa Ana River Trail. There was hundreds and hundreds of people living on the river trail. Now, if I was a researcher and I wanted to find out more about these people that live in the river trail and how they came to the river trail, whatever it is I was looking for, whatever questions I wanted to answer about that whole situation. If I wanted to do participant observational research, what that would mean was I would actually go out into the river trail and try to entrench myself, include myself into the goings on of that community, of that population. It could be a situation where maybe 2 or 3 days a week for 2 or 3 hours a day, each time I would go to the river trail and I'd walk around and talk to people, hang out with people that are there, do things like that. I knew one researcher who conducted was doing research on Skid Row, and he had a hard time getting people to talk to him. Right? Obviously, he's not from Skid Row. He's not part of that world. He's not part of that group. So people were leery of him. They didn't want to talk to him. They didn't want to deal with him. So what he started doing is he started selling. I don't think he sold them. I think he started giving away cigarettes. Like he smoked, so he would give a cigarette to somebody, and they would just take it and walk away. Then maybe the next day he showed up. He'd give them a cigarette, and then they would start talking to him. Things like that. So what you start doing is you start making yourself familiar. You become familiar with the people in that area, and maybe you befriend somebody who's in that group, and that person is willing to introduce you to other people within that group. That person's called a gatekeeper. Okay, I've had friends who've done other research where they've needed gatekeepers. I know one individual was doing research in LA within a particular area and a particular park in LA, and he's very interested in the population that lived in that area. But the problem is that population is not trusting of outsiders. So he needed somebody who was part of that group to vouch for him, to introduce him. Okay? So participant observational research is, in my opinion, probably one of the best routes for research, just because of the amount of time you're spending with a particular population. You learn a lot. But the downside is it takes a lot of time to do this. Okay? So the pros would be it lets researchers experience a specific aspect of social life. So you're not just reading about it, day-to-day life. You're actually experiencing what these things may be like, right? It's one thing for somebody to tell you what it's like to live on the river trail, but it's a very different thing to actually see how people live on the river trail, okay? So seeing something and then actually hearing about something are two different things. Researchers temporarily put themselves into roles and record their observations. Okay, so the researcher goes out there, you spend 3 hours a day, you come home, and then you write down everything that happened. Okay. Cons often do not disclose their identity. There could be a serious issue with non-disclosure of identity as a researcher, and this is kind of not an issue within research, but it's something that people wrestle with. So the idea is, at what point in time, if you're a researcher and you're working with a particular group of individuals, right? So you found a way to get into the river trail. Let's just take the river trail, for example, right? You found a way to make friends with people on the river trail. And let's say the only reason why you're able to do that is because they think you are also homeless too, or you're affiliated with somebody within a homeless encampment, okay? But under no circumstances do they suspect that you're actually a researcher and they're conducting research on them. They don't know that, okay? So the fear is, from the researcher, if you are found out, if your true identity of a researcher is found out, would you still have access to this population? And if you did have access to this population still after they found out, would they change the way they act, the way they behave, the things they show you based on the fact that they now know you're a researcher? This is something that researchers who are conducting participant observational research have to or do struggle with, okay? So it's one of those deals where, let's say you're hanging out with a group of friends playing basketball, right? Or something like that. So you're hanging out with a group of friends playing basketball. These are guys you've hung out with for 10 years. Every couple nights a week you meet at a park, you play basketball, you're all friends, you're close, right? And then some dude shows up, or somebody shows up, says, "Hey, is there any way I can play basketball with you guys?" You might be, "Yeah, sure. Welcome aboard. How are you doing? My name is whatever," right? You're gonna be friendly. What if the guy says, "Hey, I'm a researcher over at the college over here, and I'm conducting research on guys playing basketball. Is there any way that I can play basketball with you guys?" How would you feel? Would you trust this person? Would you feel comfortable with this person knowing that their goal is to conduct research, not just there to play basketball and have a good time? It would be weird, at least in my opinion, right? So if you're looking to conduct research on guys playing basketball, do you disclose your identity as a researcher? Okay. And the way you answer that question is potential harm to the participant. Okay, now if I'm conducting research on guys playing basketball, and really what is I have to ask myself, what would be the potential harm to my participants based on my research? Okay, and if there is potential harm to the participant, then you should essentially divulge your identity, or you should let them know that you are a researcher and this is what you're doing. But the problem is, once you do that, you're pretty much done there. So it's a back and forth as far as when you should and when you shouldn't allow your identity as a researcher to be known. And when you conduct research, it has to get approved by what's called the IRB, or the Internal Review Board. And what the Internal Review Board does is make sure that any research that's going to be conducted is done so with the participants' safety, essentially first and foremost. They do not want to risk any potential harm to participants. And if your research does have some potential harm, and most research for the most part does have some level of harm to participants, as far as there's always that possibility, they want to minimize that. Okay, so that's what participant observational research does. And the issue with that is, do you divulge your identity as a researcher? All right. And this is something that's actually really important. I want you to kind of pay attention to this. Okay. Code of ethics. We kind of talked about objectivity, value-free, ethical conduct. So moral principles that govern behavior are concerned with potential harm to participants. We already kind of covered this. So the idea is, if I'm conducting research and there is potential harm to my participants, would it be ethical for me to go ahead and publish that research? Would it be ethical for me to continue conducting that research? Right? At what point does my participant? At what point does the participant's safety and well-being no longer become important, and the data itself that I'm gathering is the more important than their safety? Like that's an ethical question. Okay. For the researchers, if you are a researcher and you're conducting research, the code of ethics should be accurate reporting and disclosure of data. So the idea is that no matter what information you receive, whatever information is a result of your research, no matter what it is, you will disclose it. What I mean by that is, you're not going to hide it. You're not going to leave it out of your research. You're not going to leave it out. It has to go in there. Informed consent. This is the issue when it comes to participant observational research. So informed consent is essentially making sure that your participants know that they're actually participating in research. So if I do not divulge my identity as a researcher, it'll be very much, why would my participants know that they're being, they're involved in research if they don't know that I'm, an actual researcher? So like I said, once again, it depends on what the research is and the potential harm to the participants by them not knowing that they're involved in research. And understanding and willingness to participate. Once again, informed consent. So let's say I go to the basketball court and say, hey guys, I'm a researcher over at the university, down the street, whatever, and I'm conducting research on, basketball, at parks, whatever. And I want to know if it's okay if I can hang out and play basketball with you guys, and I don't need any personal information from you. I'm just going to hang out and play basketball. Or I do need personal information from you. I want to know, age, or like, what are the age of the guys that come here? What do they do for a living? What are their families like? Do they have families? Things like that. Once I want to get more information about them personally, the potential for harm increases. Like if I just go to the park and play basketball with whoever's at the park, but I don't ask them for any personal information, the argument is that there's very little harm that can come to them. Because essentially the idea is I know nothing about them. So there's minimal risk that there's any kind of potential harm. But the thing is, if I go to the park and I start making friends with people, I start learning personal information about them, maybe it goes from the park to hanging out outside the park, at their homes, other things like that. So essentially the idea is that the more time I spend with my participants, the more information, personal information I get on my participants, then the likelihood or the potential for harm to my participants increases. Okay? So this is the dilemma for the researcher. At what point in time should they divulge their identity as a researcher. Okay. And reciprocity is essentially just mutual trust. Okay. So if I'm a researcher and I'm conducting interviews and I tell my participants that everything in the interview will be recorded and transcribed, which means I'm going to write everything down that happened in the interview, but only I will have access to it, that I'm going to change the name of your name, and so names will be changed. Any kind of identifying information will be changed. If I tell you that as a researcher, if I make a promise to my participant that I'm going to do everything I can to make sure their identity is kept secret, and I breach that, unethical. And then we have value neutrality. Let's see here. Do I want to go into this? Nah, I'm not going to go into this. We already covered this, okay? All right. So that's the lecture for today. Okay, what I'm going to do tonight, or do right now actually, is I'm going to go ahead and post a video onto the discussion board. Then I'm going to post some questions. Now, usually discussion boards will require that you pick a concept and apply it, but this is a very difficult chapter to do that with, right? So really what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and post some questions, or I'm going to give you guys some questions, and you just kind of answer that on the discussion board. Okay, it shouldn't be a big deal. This is really just for participation, okay? Answer the questions, you get your participation, so I can go ahead and make sure that you guys are still with me, and we'll be fine, okay? And then once we start getting into other chapters, as far as race, gender, sexuality, families, things like that, then it'll be a situation where you can apply more theories. So this isn't really about theories, this chapter 2. It's just going over just the research method, okay? So tonight, it's just going to be the discussion board, answer a couple of questions, and you're good for your discussion boards, okay? As far as the weekly reading reflections, those will be due on Sunday, so the 28th. So chapters, I think it's chapter 1 and 2. No, actually, was it? No, chapter 2 and 3, I think it was. I forget. I have to go back and look at things. I think it's chapters 2 and 3, but they'll be due Sunday. Okay? And as always, if you got any questions, just go to shoot me email. I've posted the instructions for the discussion boards. I posted the instructions for the reading reflections, or the reading logs, and depending on what you want to call them, on the modules. Okay? But if you have any questions, just go ahead and shoot me email. Okay? All right. Have a good one.